Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Hello and welcome to episode 15 of It's Murder Up North. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. Today's episode focuses on the murder of Julie Hogg and the many heartbreaking failings in her case that meant her family had to live in fear. It would take her mum over 17 years to finally change a law that had denied them justice. Before that, my podcast of the week is from Heather and Erin with That Will Go Good with Vodka podcast. Here is a quick taste of what to expect.
Hey there, fellow pod people. I'm Erin.
And I'm Heather.
And we are the creators of
That Would Go Good with Vodka.
Because everything goes good with vodka, including
murder, mystery, mayhem, and a spatter of inappropriate humor.
This is your personal invitation to join us as we deliver to you some of the darkest and most blood-curdling crimes that will keep you up all night hoping for daylight.
We love our home state of Michigan and like to stay close to home, but we also enjoy traveling, so we will be telling stories from all over the world.
That Would Go Good with Vodka is a weekly podcast. Tune in on Fridays for a fresh episode.
You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.
Or you can visit our social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Join us on Fridays because
I'm funny
and I know things.
Now, let's head to the episode. The house had stood empty for 3 months, silent and still over the coldest months of winter. The day before, Andrew had been in to switch the heating on and began to clean, ready for him to move in with his son. As Andrew opened the door on that cold February morning, the heating had warmed the house, but he was struck by the stale air. The musty stench consumed his senses as he made his way into the home. Everything was just how she'd left it. Dishes left to dry on the draining board, clothes still in the washing machine, and her toddler's bike waiting by the back door. He paused for a moment. Dust had settled on the surfaces and the photos washed over empty rooms, bringing back memories of happier times. He still could not comprehend why Julie had gone, leaving behind their 3-year-old son, Kevin. How could a mother do that to her child? After 3 months, there had been no news on her whereabouts, and after an exhaustive search of the house and the surrounding areas, police handed the keys back to Julie's husband. It had been the couple's first home when they got married. It was where they had had their son Kevin. It was also where they had had their arguments and their disagreements that had led to their separation. Deep down, Andrew still hoped that Julie would come home. The house was so quiet. Andrew was used to hearing Kevin playing or Julie chatting away in her bubbly manner. It felt strange wandering through the silent rooms, seeing Julie's clothes still hanging in the wardrobe. One thing stood out more than anything, a sickly sweet stench that was overwhelming. It radiated from the carpets, the sofas and the curtains. Every fibre seemed to be soaked in it. Andrew knew the house would need cleaning after being sealed for 12 weeks. He opened the windows and started to scrub down the surfaces, pouring bleach down the toilets and sinks, but the smell lingered. It was the kind of smell that would come from a bin bag being left out in the sun, a pungent mix of waste, with a blend of what he thought was the smell of rotting food. But as he continued to clean, nothing seemed to clear the odour from the home. And so he rang the one person he thought could help, his mother-in-law, Anne. She only lived round the corner and was there in a matter of minutes, cleaning supplies in hand. When Anne entered the hallway, her senses were assaulted by the putrid stench. She followed it, slowly heading up the staircase. At the top of the stairs, the bathroom door stood ajar, and the smell seemed to emanate from that small space. The door creaked on its hinges as she opened it wider. She was overcome by the stagnant air. She gagged as she entered the small bathroom. The fresh smell of bleach had failed to mask the scent. Anne had worked in operating theatres for over 20 years. Deep down she knew what the smell was, but she tried to push the thought from her mind. She had been in that bathroom when the forensics team had searched the house. For 5 days they had ripped apart her daughter's home, looking for any clues to explain her disappearance. But now she stood there, with a sense of dread. She knew what death smelt like, and the bathroom was consumed by it. The tiles were missing off the wall, the remnants of an unfinished DIY project of Andrew's. Anne leaned to smell the wall to see if that was the source of the odour, but it just had a musty scent. As she leant over the bath, her knee pressed against the bath panel, forcing it to pop open just slightly. It was enough to expel the most stomach-churning, pungent stench that filled Anne's nose and throat. Despite fearing what she might find, praying it was just a dead mouse, Anne began to pull at the bath panel, tugging at the corner until it popped loose and a soft thud came from beyond the cover. Frozen in shock, her heart stopped as she stared at the motionless skeletal hand, her daughter's hand. For 3 months, her 22-year-old daughter Julie had laid wrapped in a blanket, concealed behind the bath panel. She hadn't run away, she hadn't even left the house, and she never abandoned her son. Retching at the sight and in so much shock, Anne stumbled downstairs and out into the street, taking long, deep breaths of air. Andrew raced after her, but all Anne could do was cry, "She's under the bath!" How had her daughter's body not been found during the 5-day search, and more importantly, who was responsible for her death? 3 months earlier, Julie Hogg was a mother trying to do her best to look after her son, Kevin, after she and Andrew had decided to separate. She had been a teenager when they married, an immature, love-struck 18-year-old. Anne recalled how she looked so beautiful on her wedding day, so joyful as they whirled around the dance floor for their first dance. Sadly, the relationship just wasn't meant to be. The couple just weren't prepared for married life. Despite the heartbreak, Julie focused her attention on ensuring her 3-year-old son had everything he needed, and she did so with the loving support provided by her parents, Charlie and Anne. Julie was born on the 22nd of February 1967, the middle child with an older brother, Gary, and a little sister, Angela. Unlike her siblings, Julie was quiet and reserved. She did not make friends easily. However, once you were her friend, she was the best friend you could possibly wish for. Loyal and fun, with a warped sense of humour and an infectious giggle. As Julie entered her teenage years, she discovered fashion and makeup. She had been a gymnast and dancer since she was little and was blessed with a slender figure, luscious locks of jet black hair, which framed her pale features and deep brown eyes. Her mum described her as hopelessly messy, leaving her clothes and empty cups lying around the house. But this did not translate to her appearance. Julie took great pride in ensuring she looked presentable, from her perfectly preened hair to her precise makeup and impressive outfits. Julie wouldn't leave the house unless she was perfectly groomed. She didn't just enjoy making herself look good. She would happily do her friends' hair and makeup too. Julie aspired to be a hairdresser and would practice on anyone willing to be her guinea pig. She even convinced her dad to let her perm his hair, a sign of a true daddy's girl. Julie's parents instantly liked Andrew when she brought him home one evening. He was easygoing, relaxed, and he just seemed to complement their daughter's personality so well. Her parents had no concern when the couple decided to marry 2 years later, mainly because they too had married young, and they could see how happy Andrew and Julie were together. In 1985, Julie and Andrew married. It was a year of immense joy, but also great sadness, as her grandmother, whom she had been very close to, passed away. There was hope too, as Julie and her new husband moved into their new 3-bedroom terrace house on Grange Avenue, just around the corner from her parents. As well as being a daddy's girl, Julie also shared a close bond with her mum. And even after she had gotten married, she probably spent more time at her parents' house than she did at her own home. And when she wasn't at their house, she would be ringing them on the phone, even if she had nothing particular to say. The following year, the couple welcomed their son Kevin, but the cracks in their relationship had already started to appear. It began with petty quarrels, small disagreements that turned into raging arguments. Julie grew jealous of Andrew going out with his friends and became quite possessive, while Andrew could be selfish, doing things like trading the microwave for a car part without talking to Julie first. Charlie and Anne were unaware of how strained Andrew and Julie's relationship was. They knew the couple were seeing less of each other, as Andrew worked days and Julie had started a job delivering pizzas at night. It was only when Andrew decided to move to London for work, leaving his wife and son behind, that the truth was revealed. The couple had decided to separate. On the 15th of November 1989, the day before Julie had a separation hearing at court, Anne stopped by Julie's house to pick up Kevin. Since Andrew had left, their grandson would stay at their house on a night so Julie could go to work. Anne sat with them for a while, drinking a cup of tea while Kevin played with his toys. The young mum was clearly nervous about the formalities of the next day, and confided in her mum. She was particularly anxious about being late and requested that her mum rang her to make sure she was awake at 7:30. Anne soothed her daughter's worries by reassuring Julie that she would ring her and would be there to take her to court for 10 o'clock. Julie asked several times for her mum to ring her at 7:30 a.m, which prompted Anne to suggest that perhaps, if she was that worried, Julie should stay at their house that night, but her daughter declined. When the time came for Julie to head to work, she gave her mum a cuddle and then gently kissed her baby boy. She whispered good night to him. As she stood at the front door, she reminded the toddler to be good. Anne got into the car and waved at her daughter, standing on the doorstep in her soft peach blouse and black skirt, with her ebony curls gently moving in the breeze, and a radiant smile on her face. The following morning at 7:30 a.m, as Kevin sleepily sat eating his breakfast, Anne rang her daughter, but got no response. She tried a couple more times with the same result. Julie had been so adamant that she called her at 7:30. She had even rung her the previous night to remind her again. Worried Julie would be late for the court appearance, Anne put Kevin in the car and drove down to Julie's house to make sure she was awake. Julie lived at number 27 Grange Avenue, a red brick terrace house in the town of Billingham, which lies roughly 5 miles away from Middlesbrough in the northeast of England. As Anne pulled up outside her daughter's house on the quiet residential street, she noticed that all the curtains were closed. Anne left Kevin happily playing in the car and walked up the short garden path. She knocked on the door, rattled the letterbox and called Julie's name through the slot, but got no response. She couldn't find a gap in the curtains to get a glimpse inside the house, and no matter how much she pounded on the door, she received no answer. She got in the car and drove to the nearby phone box and rang Julie's phone, but still got no answer. Anne wondered whether Julie had decided to stay with a friend. Maybe she'd met someone and gone home with them. But that didn't make sense. When she considered how insistent Julie was that Anne rang her at 7:30. So once again she returned to the house, knocked on the door, and got the same result. No answer. She looked around the quiet street and saw a man across the road. She wandered over to ask him if he had seen Julie. The neighbour said he would usually hear Julie come home from work at about 1:30 a.m, but he hadn't heard anything that night. Anne wondered maybe she had decided to stay at someone else's house after all. Getting frustrated with her daughter, Anne once again stopped at the phone box and rang a couple of Julie's friends. None of them had seen or heard from her. She began to wonder what her daughter was playing at, and she raced back to Julie's house. This time she banged on the door so hard she disturbed Julie's neighbour, Kath, who came out to see what all the noise was about. When Anne told her that she couldn't get hold of Julie, Kath confirmed what the other neighbour had said. She hadn't seen or heard the young mum come home that night. Running out of options, Anne felt she needed to get into the house, so she went to get her son, Gary, who was working nearby. He was surprised to see his mum, but when she told him she couldn't get an answer from Julie, he returned to the house with her. The home was just as Anne had left it, the curtains still drawn and no sign of activity inside. Gary was able to break a window at the rear of the property and gain access. He made his way from room to room, searching for the spare key, but he didn't find anything. But what he did find was unnerving. Knowing his sister's cleaning habits, he expected the house to be untidy. Yet as he walked around, the house appeared immaculate. Even Julie's bed had been made neatly, which was unusual as Julie would leave the duvet pulled back to allow the mattress to air. Unable to explain her daughter's disappearance, Anne went to Kath's house next door. She was welcomed into the kitchen, where Kath was having breakfast with her son Mark and his friend Billy. Anne explained to the neighbour that she still couldn't reach Julie. She asked Kath if she would contact her if she saw her daughter, and Kath kindly agreed. Returning home, Anne contacted the police, who advised her that she should wait for Julie to call her. The operator stated that Julie had probably been out drinking, or stayed at someone else's house, and would probably be in touch soon. Anne sat waiting by the phone. It didn't ring, and the clock slowly inched towards 10 a.m, the time of Julie's appointment. Unable to bear the silence, the worried mother decided to start making inquiries amongst Julie's friends, local hospitals, anywhere she could think of, but got nowhere. As soon as she knew someone would be at the takeaway where Julie worked, Anne, accompanied by Gary and Charles, made their way down to see their daughter's employers. The shop was locked, but there were silhouettes moving in the kitchen, so Anne knocked on the door. The owner answered, and before she had even got over the threshold, she blurted out, "Oh, Julie is missing. Have you seen her? Which one of you gave her a lift home?" Anne was horrified by the lack of response. The owners became invasive and reluctant to answer. They began talking to each other in their own language. The longer they failed to respond to the family's questions, the more frustrated they became. Exasperated, Anne left the shop, but Charlie and Gary stayed, desperate for answers. The volume of the conversation began to rise, and an argument ensued, which has escalated when another worker appeared from the kitchen with a knife. He swiped it wildly at the father and son, who retaliated, and a fight broke out. Shortly after, the police appeared, and despite Anne protesting her husband and son's innocence, frantically trying to explain, their daughter was missing, and they wanted to know where she was. The shop owners were insistent that Charlie and Gary had attacked them, and so the father and son were arrested and taken away to the police station. Anne returned home deflated. Charlie and Gary were being detained overnight, and as she was greeted by her youngest daughter Angela, she could see on her child's face that there had been no news from Julie. On Friday morning, Gary and Charlie were released from police custody, and the charges against them were later dropped. However, the relief of having them home was overshadowed by the fact that Julie had still not been in contact. The pizza shop owners contacted Anne, and this time they calmly advised her that Julie had been dropped off at home at 1:30 a.m. They had waited outside until she had opened her front door before driving away. With this new information and no other possible options, Anne drove to the police station. She advised the officer at the desk that her daughter had disappeared and had last been seen on the Thursday morning being dropped off at home. The officer told Anne it was too soon to report her daughter missing, responding that the chances are she probably got home from work and decided to go out to a nightclub or a pub and is probably sleeping it off somewhere. Anne replied, "For a day and a half," and highlighted the fact that her daughter had a 3-year-old son, as well as a very important court date that Julie would not have missed unless something terrible had happened to her. Charlie stepped in to help his wife, but the desk officer seemed unmoved. A couple of other officers appeared at the desk, and after listening to the couple's pleas, they agreed to send an officer around the next day. That evening, Anne called Andrew's parents in London. She asked them to pass a message on to their son, advising him that Julie had gone missing. Anne hoped that perhaps Julie had decided to head to London to reconcile with Andrew, and that was why she hadn't been in touch. A couple of hours later, those hopes were dashed when Andrew's parents returned the call and told Anne that their son had not been in contact with Julie in the last couple of days. Julie's parents struggled to sleep that night, a million thoughts running through their minds, all the theories of where their daughter could be. It was made more difficult by the distraught 3-year-old who just wanted his mummy. The next morning, as promised, 2 officers arrived at Anne and Charlie's house. They listened as Anne explained their concerns, trying to remain calm despite her heart racing and her mind consumed with worry. The officers nodded politely as she spoke, and when she finished, one of them began to speak. "She's the perfect case of someone who is likely to just take off," he told Julie's parents. He went on to explain how he had experience of such cases. "She's a typical case. She had a marriage problems, she was due in court. She's probably come home from work to a cold, dark, empty house and decided to make a fresh start. Knowing the boy was safely looked after by you, she's probably walked down the A19 and hitched a ride to London." Anne and Charlie stared at the officer in disbelief, and despite their protest that their daughter wouldn't just walk away from her life, the officer had failed to budge on his assessment of the situation. Unable to convince the police to take their complaint seriously, the next couple of days were filled with Anne and her family frantically seeking answers. On Sunday, they returned to Julie's house and hoped that maybe someone who lived on Grange Avenue may have some information that would help them. They called on Kath, Julie's neighbour, and she gave them something that was a promising lead. Apparently, her son Mark had heard that the police had received an anonymous call regarding a girl being forced into the back of a car by 3 men at the rear of the pizza shop where Julie worked on the night she disappeared. Clinging to the hope that this may have been Julie, Anne rang the police, only to be told that it was confidential information and she should not have had any knowledge of it. As such, they refused to discuss it further. In the end, the lead turned out to be useless anyway. Julie's family were left to wonder where their loved one was. Anne was determined not to let the matter lie, and on Sunday afternoon she went to the police station again. Adamant she was not going to take no for an answer, she passionately pleaded with the sergeant to look into her daughter's disappearance, highlighting all the reasons why Julie wouldn't just disappear on her own accord, the most important reason being Kevin, her son that she was devoted to. There was no way she would just abandon him. This time the sergeant assured her they would take her complaint seriously, and that a team would visit Julie's house the next day to see if they could find anything to explain Julie's disappearance. Finally, Anne felt like she was being heard. 4 days after Julie's disappearance, on Monday the 20th of November, a team of 5 forensic officers arrived at Julie's house. Anne waited patiently for news. She would jump every time the phone rang or there was a knock at the door, only to be disappointed when it ended up being someone just wanting to offer their support. Finally, on the Wednesday, she got a call off the inspector, requesting that Anne and Julie's little sister, Angela, came down to the property to help them identify anything that might be missing. Anne agreed and was told to wait for an officer to come pick them up. A few hours after the call, and with no sign of the police officer, Anne rang Julie's house. One of the detectives answered. He advised that the officer would be there shortly. While on the phone, Anne thought she'd inquire how the search was going, but she was not prepared for the officer's response. "There's no dead bodies here, if that's what you mean." Anne was disgusted and devastated by this comment, as she slammed the phone down in disbelief. Those words had meant that for the first time she had allowed the thought that her daughter may be dead to enter her mind. When the officer arrived to collect Anne and Angela, the distraught mother was seething with anger, and this anger was not quelled by the detective who had made the caliph's comment when he greeted Anne at her daughter's front door. He apologised for his words, but it was too late. The damage had been done. It was strange being inside Julie's house, with strangers milling around, looking through her personal belongings. Anne watched as they opened the various drawers and cupboards, spreading fingerprint dust on various surfaces. She was disturbed from her observations by an officer asking her what Julie had last been wearing. It was a memory she couldn't forget. Her daughter stood waving on the doorstep with her jet black hair and deep brown eyes, waving goodbye as Anne left her home with Kevin. She could picture her standing there, dressed in a black skirt and a peach-coloured blouse. These items were missing from the property, but Anne and Angela noticed that all Julie's shoes were still present. Surely, if she had left on her own accord, she would have needed a pair of shoes, Anne pointed out. As they proceeded through the house, they entered the bathroom, which was the first room at the top of the stairs. Anne glanced around the small room, made to feel even smaller by the presence of the investigator, a forensics officer, and Angela. Instantly, Anne caught sight of something that made her uneasy. On the window ledge sat Julie's makeup bag. She knew there was no way that her daughter, who wouldn't leave the house without wearing makeup, would have run away and not taken her cosmetics. To Julie, her makeup was what gave her the confidence to go out in public. There was no way she would have left it behind. 5 days after the search was begun, it came to an end. Inspector Lee, the officer in charge of the case, called round to Anne and Charlie's house to update them on the findings. He told them, quote, "I can't guarantee you that your daughter hasn't gone to some grief somewhere in the country, but I can guarantee you that nothing untoward happened to her inside that house." Police had found nothing suspicious in the property to suggest that Julie had been hurt in her own home. To Julie's family, this didn't make any sense, and they began to question whether Julie had left on purpose. It is understandable when a loved one goes missing to try to convince yourself that they left by choice, as the alternative is too unthinkable and too painful to consider. 27 Grange Avenue was secured by the police. They changed the lock on the back door so they could still have access to the premises, and installed an alarm that would notify the police station if anyone entered the property. The day after the house had been locked up and vacated by the search teams, Charlie received a call saying someone accessed the property overnight. For a brief second, he hoped they were going to tell him that Julie had returned home, but instead they advised it had been broken into and the intruder had left the scene before police arrived. Days turned into weeks, and the family were left without answers. Police didn't have any new leads to chase. The family were invited to do appeals on local news programmes and for newspapers, always hopeful that it would bring them something to help them find Julie. As Christmas approached, they bought Julie presents and placed them under the tree. Meanwhile, the police were searching nearby waterways and anywhere else in the area. The 22nd of December was Anne's birthday. There was no way Julie wouldn't contact her mum. All day Anne tried to keep busy, but she was constantly waiting for the phone to ring or for Julie to walk through the front door. Evening came and went, and as December the 23rd dawned, so did the realisation that something terrible had happened to Julie. A small sliver of hope remained, but as Christmas passed and 1989 became 1990, that hope faded. Anne admitted she had mixed emotions. She would find herself angry at Julie for walking away and abandoning Kevin. Yet other times she had a gut-wrenching feeling that something awful had happened to her daughter. She was constantly searching her mind for some explanation as to why her little girl had disappeared. When the keys were handed back to Andrew at the end of January, it felt like the police had given up. The family wondered what they were supposed to do next. How could they continue living life as normal when they had so many unanswered questions? Anne would often recall the words the investigator said when he told her that he could not confirm her daughter's whereabouts or why she was missing, but he could tell her with absolute certainty that whatever happened to Julie did not happen in the house. That conversation haunted Anne 3 months later as she watched Julie's body being taken from the house. Julie's naked and mutilated body was taken for a post-mortem, where it was determined she had been sexually assaulted. Due to the decomposition, the pathologist was unable to give a definitive cause of death, but he speculated that it was likely to be asphyxiation. Anne was relieved to learn that Julie had died before being concealed under the bath. She couldn't stand the thought of her daughter taking her last breaths in that cramped, dark space. Police took Andrew in for questioning. He was, after all, the most likely suspect due to his relationship with Julie and the fact that they were going through a separation. 30 hours he was interrogated before being released. He was emotionally drained, by the shock of seeing Julie's body and having to endure hours of questioning. The house was searched once more, and this time Julie's personal belongings were found, thrown in the attic. Her bank cards, watch, and diary were all found up in the loft space. During the trial, one of the forensics officers stated he had performed the search of the attic. When asked how he had conducted the search, he described how he balanced on the banister, lifted up the hatch, and lit a match to see. When the match burnt out, he went to search elsewhere. It was also revealed at court that 29 officers entered the house in the 3 months that Julie was missing, but all of them failed to search behind the bath panel or find the belongings in the loft. Following the alarm alerting police to an intruder, an officer with a police dog searched the property. The dog kept returning to the bath and indicating the presence of someone, but the dog's signals were ignored. An inquiry into the handling of the search was carried out, and one of the key areas identified was a lack of communication. It was discovered that instead of performing a systematic search, areas were missed by all 5 forensic officers, who presumed one of the others had already completed that area. The delay in finding Julie's body would have unforeseen consequences when the case was taken to trial. 9 days later, Anne received the news that an arrest had been made. She was relieved that they may have caught her daughter's killer after all the months of trying to convince herself that Julie had run away and then the horrific discovery of her body. Anne felt reassured that soon they would see Julie's killer brought to justice. He was named as William Dunlop, known locally as Billy. He lived in Billingham and worked as a labourer. Accounts vary on his relationship with Julie. Some state he was a friend of her husband's, others claim he was a friend of her neighbours, and some suggest the two were romantically linked. What is known is that Billy was not a stranger to Julie, nor was he a stranger to the police. Rumours in the village regarding Billy's past were dark and terrifying if true. Apparently, when he was 16, he was chased by a police dog, and in an attempt to escape, Billy had cut the poor animal's throat. His first conviction was in 1980. He was 18 years old when he kicked a man called Barry Keane in the face. Not long after this offence, he broke into a home carrying a knife and punched a 15-year-old girl. In 1984, he was accused of raping a schoolgirl, whom he assaulted again in 1987. As the years progressed, he became known for his quick temper and violent outbursts. This was not dulled by the arrival of his first child 8 years later. And by August 1988, Dunlop would appear in court again for being drunk and disorderly and assaulting bar staff. For this offence, he received a fine and a 2-year conditional discharge. In November 1989, Billy Dunlop was living a street away from Grange Avenue. He was staying with a friend after splitting with his girlfriend. For 3 months, he avoided suspicion. Anne realised that she had met Billy. He had been at Julie's house a couple of times when Andrew was there. And seeing his face again, she realised that he was sat at Kath's kitchen table on the morning Julie went missing. Police found evidence linking him to the crime. Fibres from the blanket Julie was wrapped in matched a Billingham Rugby Club shirt that Billy had worn on the night Julie went missing. Semen on Julie's body was matched to Billy, and they had discovered her keys under the floorboards at his friend's house, with Billy Dunlop's fingerprints on the keyring. He was brought to trial in May 1991. It was a gruelling ordeal for the family as they sat in the court, watching and listening to every sickening detail. Anne had to give evidence about how she found her daughter's body. They then had to hear witnesses discussing Julie's private life, each brief fling scrutinised. Anne was distressed by this. It felt like Julie's love life was being used against her. She was being portrayed as someone with loose morals. It emerged that Billy and Julie did have sexual relations on at least 2 occasions, one being just 10 days before Julie was murdered. According to Dunlop's testimony, on the night of Julie's murder, he had been at a stag party. He exposed himself to the people gathered at the rugby club, which resulted in him being thrown out by the door staff. He recalled getting into an altercation with some other guy, and he headbutted the doorman, splitting his own forehead open. Billy went to hospital for the large cut above his eye, which needed stitches. His first version of events was that he had gone back to his friend Don's house and slept off his hangover, and Don provided him with an alibi, which he retracted when Julie's body was found, stating he didn't recall Billy coming home that night. This only made Billy amend his story to state that he must have been so intoxicated that he thought he had gone home, but must have wandered the streets and maybe he passed out somewhere. The prosecution called the emergency room doctor to testify. He told the court that Billy required several stitches, and as such he was administered anaesthetic to allow for the stitches to be done. This contradicted Billy's claim that he was so inebriated that he couldn't remember what he did, as the doctor stated he would not have used anaesthetic if the patient was heavily intoxicated. Billy was brought to the dock to testify. He was questioned and cross-examined for 8 hours. He continued to portray himself as an innocent man who had been framed. As the hours of questioning passed, Billy began to falter. He began to shake, just slightly at first, but it was getting increasingly noticeable as the prosecution scrutinised every word. It looked like the suspect was going to crack. But then the judge decided to retire the court for the day. After 3 weeks and 2 days of jury deliberation, Julie's family anxiously awaited the verdict, hoping that this would end their nightmare. The 12 members of the jury filed into the courtroom, and the judge asked the foreman for the verdict. Normally there is a silent anticipation, but for some reason the jurors began to look at each other and speak in whispered tones. Unbelievably, the jury had not elected a foreman, and although they had been deliberating for 2 days, they had failed to reach a majority verdict. The room was filled with chatter. The lawyers were speaking with the judge, and the onlookers were speculating over what was going to happen next. Eventually, the judge silenced the room. He had come to a decision. He had no choice but to order a retrial. It had been an exhausting 3 weeks, and to learn that they would have to sit through it all again was a crushing blow for the family. 6 months later, they were back in the courtroom. This time the case was being overseen by Judge Henry Ognall, who had presided over the Yorkshire Rippers trials. The second trial was simply a repeat of the first, but still just as agonising, having to listen to the details all over again. The jury went out to deliberate, and 5 hours later they returned to the courtroom. Anne held Charlie's hand tightly, closing her eyes and slowing her breathing, praying to hear the words that would allow her heart to heal. "Have you reached a decision?" Judge Ognall asked the foreman. "No." "Have you reached a majority verdict?" "No," replied the foreman. There was stunned silence. By not reaching a verdict, the jury were basically declaring Billy Dunlop innocent, and the judge was forced to declare an acquittal. It was explained to the family that the jury could not come to a decision as there was no official cause of death. A ruling by the pathologist was unable to make due to the decomposition. If Julie had been found sooner, her manner of death may have been identified. Billy Dunlop walked free from court that day. He returned to his family in Billingham and started living his life again, while Anne and her family started their prison sentence. The police were certain that Billy Dunlop was responsible for Julie's murder, yet an 800-year law would prevent him from being tried again. The rule of double jeopardy, which prevents someone from being tried for the same crime twice. The family were naturally devastated that their daughter's killer was free to walk the streets. He had gone away with murder, and there was nothing the family nor the law could do. Julie's family had to live in the same town as her killer. They walked the same streets, bought food from the same shops. The chances of seeing him in such a small place were high, and the thought was terrifying. In her book, Anne admits that she would drive around the town, hoping he would be crossing the road in front of her and she would run him over. She could visualise herself doing it, down to what it would feel like as the car passed over him. Anne learned that this was a common symptom for someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which she had been diagnosed with not long after she found Julie's body. She would have terrible and realistic flashbacks in which she could see and smell everything that she had experienced. Anne and Charlie moved into a bungalow, but they never felt secure, thinking that Billy could be watching them through the windows. The suggestion that was made in court played on Anne's mind. It was theorised that after murdering Julie, Billy stayed in the house and cleaned up the property. It was speculated that he may have still been there when Anne first called round to wake Julie up. The prosecution also claimed that Billy was the intruder who set the alarm off. He was planning on moving Julie's body, but was disturbed by the arrival of a police officer who had come to investigate the alarm. The thought that Billy could enter and exit a property as well as potentially conceal himself sent shivers down Anne's spine. Her little bungalow, with all its windows on ground level, just didn't feel like home, and in the end the couple moved to a flat on the top floor of a tower block. Billy Dunlop knew he had gotten away with murder. He would proudly proclaim that he had committed a murder and had been cleared of all charges. He felt untouchable. He would happily tell anyone willing to listen, especially after a couple of pints down the pub. Almost as soon as he was acquitted and released, he was back to his old ways. In October 1991, he was accused of attempting to sexually assault a woman while he was out drinking. And in 1997, he received a prison sentence for threatening to kill his girlfriend. She had sought refuge with her children at a home for abused women, but Billy managed to track her down. He even had the audacity to go into a police station and ask directions for the safe house. Thankfully, the police were aware of him and the threats he had made against his girlfriend, and they arrested him on the spot. While Billy was living up to his hard man reputation, his victim's family was struggling to cope. Charlie had sunk into a deep depression. Gary was riddled with guilt that he hadn't checked on his sister that night. And Kevin was growing up without his mum. When he was little, he would cry for her. He had been told that she had died after falling in the bathroom. His father Andrew felt this was easier for him to comprehend than telling him that his mother had been murdered. However, when he started high school, Kevin began to learn the truth. Other students referred to him as the son of the murdered pizza girl, and this led him to seek answers. At 13 years old, he went to the newspaper archives at the local library. He searched the newspapers for 1989. Beginning at January, slowly he made his way through each month. He found articles regarding his mum's disappearance, and another with the headline, "Please Come Home to Us," which featured a picture of the two of them. Unable to face any more of the headlines, Kevin left the library, still not knowing the truth. 2 weeks later, he plucked up the courage to ask what really happened to his mother. Imagine finding out at 13 years old that your mum hadn't died after having an accident in the bathroom, that your family had lied to you, and you uncovered the lies through gossip and newspaper articles. When he asked his dad about his mum's death, he also asked if the killer had been caught. Andrew told him the truth, that his mother's killer was still walking the streets of Billingham, working as a labourer. Not long after he learned the truth, Kevin visited his old house, where his mum had died. He was haunted by the fact that despite pictures and stories from his grandparents, he had little recollection of his mum. As he knocked on the door at Grange Avenue, he hoped the house would remind him of her. The new occupants welcomed him in and let him look around, but sadly the memories of his childhood had been lost. Billy Dunlop had met Donna Marie Williams, and she had become pregnant with his child. He seemed to have settled down, however his violent nature could not be extinguished. Billy became convinced that Donna was having an affair with a man called Sean Fairweather, and in a fit of anger he stabbed Donna with a carving knife, puncturing her lungs. He then turned on Sean, beating him viciously with a baseball bat, causing severe facial injuries. Fortunately, Sean, Donna and her unborn baby survived the violent attack. Billy Dunlop pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 years in prison for causing grievous bodily harm. Just like every other court appearance, Anne and Charlie were there to witness the verdict. It was a relief to Julie's family that he was behind bars, but it made them sick to think that a man capable of murder had been allowed to walk free and almost kill 3 more people. Anne described it as, quote, "It was like letting a savage dog loose without a muzzle in a children's playground." The grieving mother knew how the legal system worked. Billy Dunlop would probably not serve his full sentence. He would be free to hurt another innocent person. One thing I have discovered doing this podcast is how grief can be a powerful motivator. Anne channeled her anger and sorrow and focused on fighting for justice. She wanted to see the archaic double jeopardy law abolished. While Anne vowed to keep fighting, Billy Dunlop was behind bars, but still causing trouble. He wrote hostile letters to Donna Williams. He threatened to kill her in the same manner he had killed Julie Hogg. He proceeded to tell her exactly how Julie had died. Donna, fearful that Billy would act on his threats, took the letters to the police. Although Billy had literally confessed to killing Julie, they couldn't do anything regarding the confession, thanks to the double jeopardy law. His ex-girlfriend wasn't the only person Billy Dunlop bragged to. He also told a guard at the prison about how he had killed Julie Hogg in 1989. He boasted that she had rejected his sexual advances and mocked his black eye. He told the stunned prison guard how he raped Julie before strangling her. His confession was cold and full of pride. Unbeknownst to Billy, since police had received the letters of Donna, they had set up an operation to secretly record the conversations between Billy and the prison guard. Over 60 hours of recordings were analysed. It didn't matter. The police couldn't touch Billy, even though his own words had implicated him in the crime. He was, however, questioned by the police regarding the confession, and he freely admitted that he was truthful. He provided them with a full account of what happened to Julie Hogg. He repeated the first part of his story up to the point where he left the hospital. But now he stated that he didn't just wander the streets. He went to his best friend's house, Mark Ward's, to tell him about his crazy night. When he arrived, he was told by Mark's mother, Kath, that his friend was already in bed. Billy described how he had seen Julie arrive home from work, and he saw that her bedroom light was on, so took the opportunity to visit her. Julie invited him in, and they had a cup of tea and a chat. He told them he'd become annoyed when she started laughing at the cut on his head and made jokes about how the other man was tougher than him. Infuriated that she was mocking him, he lost his temper, grabbed hold of the frightened girl, and threw her on the floor in the living room. He placed his hands around her neck until she stopped breathing. When he realised she was dead, he panicked. He went out into the garden to figure out his next move. He decided to remove all Julie's clothes, then wrap her in a blanket before carrying the young mother's lifeless body up the stairs. At first he thought of placing her in the attic. He couldn't keep his balance on the banister and had to find another option. As he stood under the loft hatch at the top of the stairs, he noticed the screws holding the bath panel in place. He thought that would be the ideal place until he could come back and dispose of the body. Billy Dunlop described in horrific detail how he had forced Julie's body into the tiny space under the tub, using brute force as well as kicking her to make her fit. He then methodically tidied up, making sure the house looked pristine. No one knows for certain what he did with key pieces of evidence, such as the clothes he and Julie were wearing that night. It has been suggested that the bins were emptied that day, so the evidence would have been removed before anyone knew there was something wrong. Hearing his confession was bittersweet. The police had always had the right suspect, but all they could do was charge him with perjury for lying at his 2 murder trials. He proudly stood in court and admitted murdering Julie. He smiled smugly, knowing he wouldn't be punished for it. However, for the perjury charge, he was found guilty and sentenced to a further 6 years in prison. Billy Dunlop may have felt untouchable. However, beyond the prison walls, a powerful campaign was taking hold. The passion of a grieving mother had started a movement to change the law in England. It was going to be a tough challenge to fight against a law 8 centuries old. She did find some formidable allies to help her in her fight for justice, ranging from her local MP to the Home Secretary Jack Straw and Doreen Lawrence, the mother of 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered in a racially motivated attack in London in April 1993. Although the men who attacked him were tried, they too were acquitted. Because of her son's murder, Doreen was especially aware of Anne's pain. Not only had they both lost children in a horrific manner, but their children's killers could not be brought to justice due to a law that was protecting the guilty. Thanks to Anne and her supporters, there was a review into the double jeopardy clause, and in 2003 it was decided that the law should be amended to allow those who commit serious crimes to be retried for the same offence, with the proviso that there was new evidence to warrant a retrial. Billy Dunlop may not have been concerned about this decision, as he believed his was a historic crime, except for the fact the amendment was applied retrospectively. This meant that if new evidence was presented in Julie Hogg's case, Billy would be retried for murder. And the police had something that was missing from the earlier tries: a full confession from the killer. In 2006, Billy Dunlop appeared in court, charged with the murder of Julie Hogg. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 17 years, which means he will be eligible for parole next year. Because of Anne's battle for justice, other families got closure too, including the family of Stephen Lawrence, who saw 2 suspects tried and convicted for his murder. Anne is another example of how grief can be a powerful driving force towards change. Thanks to her resilience and persistence, a law that had been in place for 800 years, which helped protect the guilty and caused suffering to the innocent, was abolished. I personally love covering cases like this one. It shows how strong the human spirit is, that we can turn our greatest pain into something positive. Anne went from a mother and nurse to someone who stood in front of politicians and lawmakers, demanding change. She made them see the world from her perspective, asking them to consider if Julie had been their child or someone else that they loved. Would they believe she was being let down by the existence of the double jeopardy law? For her formidable fight for change, Anne was honoured with an MBE.
Thank you for joining me for episode 15 of It's Murder Up North.
I would love to chat with you on Facebook or Twitter, and if you want to support the show, please leave a review wherever you listen. You can also support It's Murder Up North by becoming a Patreon member.
Episode 16 will be available on Sunday, so in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.